Thank you. Okay, if we can go to the minutes of the meeting and from the 18th of October. Thank you. Are there any... Okay, if we can go to the minutes of the meeting and from the 18th of October. Thank you. Right, sorry about that. The live stream is just getting sorted out. So, are there any comments on the minutes anyone's got in relation to the accuracy of the minutes of that meeting, or are we happy for me to sign them as a true and accurate reflection? No? Okay, well, we'll sign the minutes as a reflection of the previous meeting. Can I ask Emily then, would you like to talk about the DSG monitoring report?
Sure. So the paper sets out the forecast outcome variance for the current financial year as at quarter 2. It's important to note that there's a forecast £2 million overspend, which is a deterioration of £1.6 million from the prior reported period, which was as so the adverse movement is entirely due to high need costs across both the early years and stocks. So £0.2 million adverse movement on the early years position and £1 million position. The appendix to the report shows that budget group level detailed forecast movements. So to note the key movements of £500,000 entirely related to out of county placements, which you see is just £1 billion overspend and worse than the prior period position. So this is due to the shortage of in-county placements to meet the increased demand and due to inflation. So mitigating activity includes the spend based expansion, which is the capital programme, and commissioning the early years variance is due to the demand for budgeting levels on the inclusion funds. So obviously there will be note the other variants in the budget group. That's sort of key.
Questions first of all. Can you remind me, did we have a carry forward on DSG current year?
Yes, I believe we did. In fact, we'll have to carry forward from yeah. I think there was a carry forward. We've got some reserves. That carry forward balance. Carry.
The other one I've got personally is just around recovery plan. We're constantly catching up. Obviously, higher needs is being a thought. I think there's a paper on higher needs, and I think that will cover the project plan and the way that we aim to balance going forward with the budget. Is that correct?
Thanks, Chair. There is a detailed, or more detailed report around high consensus. I think we will need to come back with that recovery and the full recovery plan for high needs. I certainly expect the situation to get worse in terms of overspend which we will explain and we will put in every litigation we can against the minutes. So I think that a more detailed discussion around recovery and around that, I think we need that before, really. That means we'll get Andy and yourself and some of what we're doing.
So forum members, have you got any questions you'd like to ask? No, so I think
through you, Chair. So there was a request for further information there, information whether there was code and ESG, and that was answered. And then the suggestion was made to possibly to have a later item there in more detail on the higher needs recovery plan, but possibly also that be a standing item, which is an approach that the panel, sorry, the forum's taken in the past.
yes, that's correct. Okay, so if forum's happy to note the forecast outturn, and we'll move on to the next paper on funding announcements. Emily, that's you again.
Yeah, so it's just going to be a verbal update for this one. I think we also intended this item to be a discussion to make it last.
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear on the Zoom. I don't know if you can hear me, but if you could speak into the mic, it would really help.
Is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
It is a verbal update, this item, because we obviously presented the provisional settlement to Schools Forum in October, which is from the July announcement. We still await the final settlement, which is expected for the end of this week, beginning of next week. Obviously, we've had the autumn statement in between, which did have some increases to budget. We're waiting to see the specific impact on West Northampton of those announcements. So the autumn statement included an announcement that the core schools budget in England will receive an additional 2.3 billion in each year, next year and the year after, and that's 2 billion more than what was published at the last spending review, which was 2021. So the headline sort of state that restores the per pupil funding in real terms to 2010 levels, and it's an average cash increase of more than £1,000 per pupil by 24-25. Of course, there sort of remains uncertainty around energy prices, inflation, and pay awards next year. Pay awards actually cost 1.3 billion this year alone, so it's unclear at the moment actually how generous the increases that are announced in the autumn statement actually are. There's been some other help announced in the autumn statement as well, so obviously schools currently receive moment this last beyond next year, and particularly as the government announced 500 billion to spend on energy efficient upgrades. So again, sort of details around that are unclear. We're expecting it to potentially be capital, the sort of the announcement said that this was on top of 1.8 billion capital funding for schools addition allocation. So they're the sort of additional bits of funding that we announced. So we're waiting to see what the specific impact of West Northampton is. We're also unclear as to how the additional funding is going to come through. Obviously, last year it came from central grants. Whether they'll do something this year or not, I don't know. That's basically where we're at the moment. The latest announcement.
Thank you, Emily. I'll open this up in just a second, but there's a couple of things. It's welcome, obviously, extra money coming into the sector, particularly the financial pressures that are on the public purse anyway. But we've got obviously immediate pressures now. We've got these pressures from so restoring the funding to 2010 levels in real terms will have a positive impact. But given the high needs and the way the education landscapes changed since then, so we're seeing a lot of support needed for children that are in our schools, particularly around mental health and around additional needs. It's still going to leave a real strain. And I think there was something like 400 million of the money that will go into high needs budget, which will go some way towards perhaps closing the gap that's currently there, but not necessarily providing the additional needs that we see coming through. So it'll be interesting taking forum's members' views on where they think that will leave us and what our strategies or advice would be to our colleagues. So in the room, are there any comments anyone would like to make on those funding announcements and whether forum should be looking at any further representations and in what form alongside the local authority in relation to funding?
I do, Chair, if that's okay. It's not, although it's not directly related to what you just mentioned, it's more potentially a question for the PFI, is that you mentioned around capital money to support energy efficiency, and I appreciate this is an academic question, but I think perhaps we just need to consider what that looks like for PFI schools, given the conditions based on PFI schools. So a question for later, it was more just a note to remind myself to ask that question later. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. And from our colleagues joining remotely, is there any comments, any questions or any thoughts you'd like to put forward?
Chair, I have a couple of comments, if I may. It's Vanessa. Emily, I'm really sorry. I missed the number that you announced, your expectation in terms of what the funding will be.
So we haven't received anything specific in terms of West Northamptonshire Council, but nationally, the autumn statement included an announcement that the core schools budget in England received an additional 2.3 billion in each next year and the year after, and that's 2 billion in total on top of what was already announced in the spending review last year. And so we await the specific West Northampton acts and the autumn statement. We should hopefully see that next week.
Thank you. And so a question, do we have autonomy on how we distribute those additional funds?
I'll leave this one to Beth, but it is probably largely going to be on formulas. But again, we await to see how they're going to announce the additional part. Last year it was a supplementary grant in large part for the schools block, additional element, the high needs block, was paid to local authorities, and it's up to local authorities to decide how that would be distributed. But we don't know how this additional funding will through this financial year. If it's a supplementary grant, then the sums will be determined by government. It's sort of within our power, it will go through some kind of sausage machine that looks at, and it'll work through formula and various factors.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's lovely. Any more questions? I think one of the things that does strike me when I did some backpacking type calculations is by the time you've taken the extra 2 billion and looked at the shortfall in funding for the pay rises that have been given, you're going to have about 2/5 of nothing left to fund, it might fund the pay rise that's already been given and give a bit of room for whatever comes next year, but I'm not sure that it's actually going to put much more capacity into schools, to be honest. That isn't wishing to sound too cynical, because any money is gratefully received and will prevent us from either having insolvency issues or running having to run further deficits or make significant changes within our schools by having that funding come in that would have had a detrimental impact on pupils. So it is welcome, but it's probably not going to put a lot of capacity back into the system just based on what's already there.
Chair, can I ask a question? I mean, is that, can I just clarify, is that 2.3 billion for 22-23, so the current financial year?
No, it's
No,
next
it's
year,
23.
next year and the year after.
Okay, so, you know, big secondary school, I have moved from being in a position of being 20 grand in surplus to being about 180 grand in deficit because of all the energy crisis and the, you know, the pay awards that have come through in the last, you know, few months. So that's the sort of position that we're in. And if it's not coming this financial year, then that's going to be a big hole for us to fill one way or another.
Yes, I'd agree. Those kind of numbers sound to me like a very well-known school. It's not frivolous with the money, and is a typical pressure I would see as well with another hat on the school resource management advisor as a typical type of pressure that we're seeing coming through. So without having to make significant changes, you will end up with an unfunded this year, but at least the funding will drop in next year.
And speaking to the other secondary heads in the county, that's, you know, what they're having similar difficulties balancing their budget. So it's a similar sort of £200,000 on a typical secondary school in our West Northants Council.
So it's easy to see where that 2 billion will go without putting any more capacity within the system. Okay.
I think I really welcome the discussion. I think it's really important as a group we keep discussing what those pressures are, and then once we have a bit more clarity what the art of the possible is between us that we can do. If there's £2.3 billion coming into education, that's wonderful. At the moment, the Local Government Association says that the high needs pressure is about £2 billion. That's just meeting need today, and we know that that need is going through the roof. You all know that, and I know that. So I think that I don't think that that sticking plaster sounds like a great sticking plaster. It's a lot of money, but I don't think it's going to actually make a difference. So I still think the pressures that we've got now, that's part of the reason I said I expect high needs to continue going up. So I think we do need to keep a really, really close eye on the pressures on schools. And a £200,000 swing on a big sector is really scary. I'm also very conscious of some of our early years providers that are one person and operating at home, and a tiny little bit of pressure onto them. We'll just see them disappear, and we're already seeing some early years providers vanish, sadly. So I think we've got from early years all the way through to FE. I think FE will be squeezed massively as well. I think we've got a lot to look at. The second bit I just want to say specifically around high needs is I'm sure everyone will have seen 2 weeks ago the new Ofsted framework was released around SEND and around how local areas will be inspected. I thought it was fascinating that that was released before the review of the National SEND Review. And now I might be reading too much into that. They were both due in the autumn. We've got the new Ofsted framework, which starts on January the 1st. So we had a month to prepare for that, including Christmas. We still don't have the review of the National SEND Review and that new National SEND Delivery Plan. I don't know if I'm being naive. I'm hoping that might come with some funds behind it. I think watch this space, but that will be part of any response that we have in terms of our recovery around high needs. Obviously, that's going to be. Yeah.
I just wanted to let people know that as I belong to a group called F40, which is 40 lead members in the East Midlands, and we have put together quite an in-depth report which we sent into the Department of Education to inform them of our position with our special education needs children and what the pressures are on you for looking after those children, which we're all obliged to do, and obviously willingly doing, but there are costs involved, and that was quite a thick document that we did send in. We haven't had a reply to that yet, but we kind of feel that it works better if 40 councils put forward the argument rather than one. So just to say that I have done that on behalf of us.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I know that all board members were very grateful that work is going on in conjunction with the other local authorities and highlighting needs into central government and into their decision making. Are there any more comments you'd like to make on this, or if not, Ben, do you want to lead on to the high needs, or Emily, isn't it, high needs budgets plans?
Yeah, so we're going to do a bit of a tag team on this one. So I'll start sort of just with the general overview on the high needs budget, and I think Beth's going to talk through the appendices report, and then I can hand over to Anthony and
Sorry, I'm really struggling to hear you.
move the microphone closer.
Thank you.
Right, so the paper sets out the provisional settlement, the increase of 2.8 million, and that is specific to West Northants. As I said before, we're waiting the final settlement, and we expect to hear about that, and we should be a share of the additional 2 microphones now. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. And so we hope to see an additional share of 400 million for SEND, which has been announced nationally. So the paper sets out a review that we've done of the expenditure budgets from this financial year to next financial year for the centrally controlled components of high needs block. And so we reviewed things like inflation, demographic growth, and any other sort of pressures that we're seeing, or any other investments in services. So one of them is the high needs project reserve, which you'll see in the table at the top of page 4 and at the top of page 5 as well. So you'll see that the figures sort of represent the known assumptions and pressures identified so far, and there does remain some volatility, and we're obviously awaiting final settlement. And there's a piece of work ongoing as well around high needs and joint funded placements to ensure that the education elements of joint funded placements are accurately forecast in the high needs block. So that may or may not lead to additional pressures in the high needs block. So that really sort of sets out the high needs budget for the next financial year. Don't know whether you want to pause now for questions or whether you want to move on to Beth talking through the other appendices which relate to sort of the special schools budget.
If there's any questions anyone's got on Emily's section first. Okay.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. So the appendices, the first one shows the indicative special schools budgets. Our special schools are largely full, so we weren't expecting a massive increase here. The pressure tends to go into other areas in SEND units and independent sector. But what we have in this appendices is the sort of requirement we have, which is to provide schools with their indicative budgets before the end of February. This comes in 3 parts. The main parts is the top-up funding that we give, the old element 3, and that's based on what we call a RAS update, where special schools send in their pupil level data in the RAS score, and we give them their indicative top-up. So it's based on actual pupils in school. We're still going through that, so I haven't published the prior year figure because we're still going through that for the current year adjustments. But if you look at the place funding, which we have to split into the first 5 months of our financial year, which is the last 5 months of the academic year 22-23, and then an estimate of the actual fixed place funding for the last 7 months of the financial year 23-24, which is the first 7 months of the academic year 23-24. And then there's a small bit of protection because this year for special schools, there's a 0% MFG, minimum funding guarantee, which means that on a per pupil basis, they can't have less than they did in 22-23. So this ties back to the table in the main document that shows the overall budget for special schools of 23.9 million. The place funding increase, if you look at the total place funding that we estimate for 23-24, it's about 11.7 million. And in this year, 22-23, it's 11.2 million. So you can see it's not a massive increase in numbers. The next appendices fulfills one of our duties as Schools Forum members, which is to review the high needs places that are set in West Northants. Have a look at that in the future documents. So this sets out the academy places that we've set with the ESFA from September 2023, which we have to do in November. And we also set at the same time and take this to you in the Schools Forum for the maintained, so you can see the whole picture. And you can see the increase in numbers between those that were set in academic year 22-23 of 226. And the total place numbers set for 23-24 258. Any questions? Thank you. Sorry, I should introduce Andy to you now, or let Ben do an introduction.
Yes. Right, thank you. Colin, can you hear me online still? Because we moved microphones around. It's not wonderful. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, and then I'll hand over to Andy Kim, who joined us recently as a project manager. And I've said he's created a massive amount of momentum already in the council. Glad that you're going to get to hear from him this afternoon. I just wanted to give a very quick overview of some of the SEND improvement work that we're doing specifically with the funding. We've already touched on lots of that. One of the exercises that we're completing first is just to get a really good understanding of need. I think we need to start there. So I'll go into how we're delivering those needs analysis first, how this group will be informed of that work. We're then obviously looking at what we've got in terms of the supply of places and provision to meet that need. And then we're looking at how we allocate the resources we have. So we need to understand what the demand is, we need to understand how we can best meet it, and then how we can use funding appropriately. And that's the bit Andy's going to touch on. The needs analysis will take a couple of different forms. There'll be a lot of quantitative information in there. There will be qualitative as well. It will be co-produced with schools, with parents, with all partners as well. And it will build on partly the Mastodon survey, which is the census in schools, in special schools. What are the primary needs of children that we are currently educating? Where do those children live? Where do they go to school? Where are they likely to be over the next 5-7 years? So we can start to do that forecasting. And then for the first time ever, I think this is a really good move by the DfE. The SCAP returns, which councils are duty bound to do. SCAP is our where do all children live and where are they likely to go to school? So have we got sufficient school places or not? We've had to do, councils have had to do that every year for all children. And that works out, have we got enough school places or not? And that will work out if we get any basically funding from the DfE. For the first time ever next year, we will have to do a SEND specific one as well, which I think is going to be long overdue. I think it's really, really helpful. What that will do, that will give us the opportunity to have that discussion directly with the DfE around the demand we know we have for children that should be in special schools or specialist provisions, and the supply we have to hopefully really build that case across West Northants, which I know some really feel very keenly and daily, that we really don't have sufficient places. So that's where we're starting. Very number driven, but built up then with the qualitative from parents, from colleagues in schools as well. It'll give us a really good picture of what we know we need. What we then will do is move into that sufficiency analysis. So working with all of our current schools, our current units, of where do we currently have specialist provision? Is it in the right place geographically? Is it in the right place in terms of meeting need? Do we have an autism unit built where we're in an area of town where we actually don't have a great demand for autism, but we might have sensory impairment needs, for example? And that will really help us have conversations about how we best meet need rather than reactive, which I think there's been a lot of today and a lot of conversations with how we speak very nicely to schools and ask them to take a few extra children. A much more planned way, so we know what's coming, because we do know where children live. We do know what needs they have from a really early stage. There will always be some that come in and and then if we really can join the dots up properly, which I believe we can, we start to really think about how we provide not just education, but we provide that more holistic support for those children with autism and families. So thinking with our health, our social care companies, and within West Northampton, we will do that at local level. So we're already looking at planning areas across the patch, looking at 9 different areas across West Northampton, where we will ensure there is a sufficient provision to meet the needs of families that live in the. So that's the plan long term around that demand analysis and that needs analysis. How we do a lot of that and how we use the funding, this guy's responsibility. So I'm going to pass over to Andy. No pressure at all, but just to talk about some of the operational.
Okay, good afternoon, Forum, and thank you for giving me a few minutes to, as Ben said, to explain where we are. Refer to the numbers on the slides which we in your pack. So if you're on slide 29, the important thing is to look first of all at why we're doing it, what is the objective, and it is to provide consistency, clarity, transparency across the county, and it's to improve, as Ben said a few moments ago, it's the outcomes for the children with SEND. Whilst there is one project which is referred to as the SEND funding project, there are 2 elements to it. One element is the funding for children and young people who don't have an EHC plan, but do have some needs and require funding, and that's currently referred to as high needs funding. And the second part is then for the children with education and healthcare plans. So a couple of separate slides with the 2 elements to the project. We're not doing this alone, as you would expect. We're doing it with co-producing this, and we have a working group which includes members from mainstream schools, from SEN and resource units, from early settings, and also from colleges. Now, it's not just about the education settings. We also have support from MP Action. So we have parents also including the working group. And as you can imagine, there's lots of financial analysis required, and that's the stage we're at this moment in time. And from a timescale perspective, we are looking at the 1st of September 2023, so the beginning of the next academic year for mainstream schools, the units and early years. FE will come later. It's got a different timeline, but the objective is to implement what I'm going to show you across all sectors. The graphic on slide 30 is literally exactly what I just said. It just shows it from a perspective of it's one project, but within that there are 2 separate projects. And just I make no excuses for repeating the objective. It is this consistency and clarity across the place. If I then focus you on one project, so we look at the non-EHC plan. The project team are looking at the panel process. Now, when I say panel process, there are a number of different panels for different education settings. So panels for early years, panels for schools, and within that, then you've got other panels such as SEMH and HIV. So looking at the process, we're looking at the makeup of the panels, we're looking at the funding criteria. And one of the key things with the funding criteria is it's really important for us now to align with the new SEND ranges. So there's some work being done there to ensure that the panels, it's all joined up. And we're also looking at the opportunity of enhancing the the checks towards making sure that we are supporting the agreed outcomes. From a timing perspective, whilst September the 1st is a key date from an academic year perspective, we do envisage some of the changes and some of the improvements could be implemented earlier. So we do look at strengthening the panels in these springtime. So we're not waiting for September the 1st and saying, here's some magic, let's go ahead with that. We're looking at that earlier where we can. And supporting all of this, and also the second project I'll show you in a moment, is we have to have a joined up thinking from the communication perspective. So it's not standalone, whereby we just have some communication and training as well on non-EHC finance funding. It will be joined up communication, including the Senate ranges and including the EHC fund. And then if we refer to slide 32, and Beth said a few moments ago, you mentioned RAS, which is it's a commonly referred to acronym, but let me just explain. It's Resource Allocation System. And this is a system that's currently in place in the special schools. So whilst we're talking about a launch year for mainstream schools, units, and early years, and then later on for colleges, it's actually a rollout. We're actually live with the RAS scores with our partner, IMAS, already in all the education systems. Again, we have a working group, and the idea with the RAS software is it would identify the needs of the children, and it would actually then link it to within bounds, and then it would link it to the financial banding. And with any rollout such as this, when you're looking at software rollout, again, we don't stand alone, and what we're looking to do is to have a series of information events which still need to be calendarized, so we can explain to education settings, to CENCOs, to parent groups, to parents, what the changes are. And finally, because I realise I've got a few minutes of the time today, if I look at slide 33, from a next steps perspective, we would expect that financial modelling would be the next thing we're working on, which is happening at this moment in time. We plan to provide an updated forum on the elections, which I understand is the 7th of February. And as I said, without repeating verbatim what's on the slide, the rollout, the target date is mainstream schools, units, and early years in September. From a FE perspective, that will come a little bit later. And we're working with we're talking to the FE Send funding group in January. That's that on the timeline. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Questions for Andy?
I'll be doing anyway any favours, or I didn't start taking aim now. So I've got multiple, so do you want me just to run through them and then we'll kind of go with it? Okay, so the first one is you mentioned around looking at data gathering exercise. Okay, so the first question would be around understanding what that looks like. Because what we're essentially saying is that we almost trusted that data is through to where's the QA process in that, i.e. if you're identifying areas of need. If you're basing your whole rationale on that data, you need to be assured that data is correct in terms of those areas of need. So that would be the first question around that QA process. The second, we didn't mention early years. So the identification as early identification helps us to strategically plan further down the line. To use your phrase, the situation is going to get far worse before it gets any better. Therefore, by knowing that information early, you're then able to plan accordingly for it. So first two questions is around the QA process, around the data that you're gathering, and the second is around early years. So I dare say the right early years practitioners would like to know that information because ultimately A supports them and then future placements and so on.
Dan, thanks. Question. In terms of the QA, hopefully what you've seen from Andy, what you've heard from me, this is not the council doing it alone. This is a group of people that includes leaders from mainstream schools, from early years providers, etc. We will look at all of that together. We're not going to do, there's no reason, there would be no drive for us to look at that. Like, we're going to do that, to look at what do we know about needs now. So from census, from early years, that's an issue that I didn't use to early years, but I completely agree how important that is. And Becky and I have had lots of those conversations already. So we will come up with some analysis and we will draw some conclusions in that, but that we is not the council. That is we collectively. Dan, I'll tell you your example. As a school with a provision, I will come and talk to you about that provision, make sure that you agree that the analysis is right. We're talking forecasts, so we're not talking accurate. Yeah, well, so we're talking forecasts. We're not talking telling children where they are, where they'll be for the rest of their education, but we're talking informed information that should help us. That's what I want to get to. So the QA will be all of us. Early years, I couldn't agree with. The process that I didn't go into massive detail, but more than happy to, around SCAP, which is the annual process we have to submit to the DFM. What we do there is we take school census, how many children are in every school, how old are they, where they live, and then we go back to health colleagues and we take birth data. So we look at that 0 to 5 age, and again we look at where our children live, where they might go. What we need to do is a lot more joining up there with our health colleagues to understand that earlier identification. That is a gap. That's something that we know is a gap and we already work with health colleagues on. And then we overlay that with things like housing growth and other bits to come up with those forecasts of where we believe people are. What we will be doing is doing that a lot more. I think that's going to be the way going forward. So hopefully that answers a couple of those first comments.
Can I just add to this, and Ben did fleetingly mention it, but I think it's really important that we have invited our parent carer forum to be a part of all of these boards that we're putting together, because I think in the past parents have been overlooked and they've been done to rather than be part of the progress. So we are envisaging them being on every board that we have to do with them in the future. There is an official parent forum which families can join, and they will be invited to come to all of our meetings.
Okay, I'm kind of phasing my question, so I'll keep going. So then the second question is around the slide or page 23, which is the 98 HCP plans I need funding block. So you touched on the project team reviewing front panel process and so on. And I believe I shared this with you then on the SEND ranges, is that it almost felt like it was done in the wrong order, because for me there would need to be an infrastructure in place from that panel review process. So the ranges have almost been given to everyone. So you know the box has been opened, hasn't it, really, in terms of how you're assessing and looking at those children. But you can't then submit those applications if you haven't got the kind of process in place or the infrastructure in place in order to go to submit those reviews. We know the delays that are taking place at the moment in filtration that's leading across all sectors. So I guess really the question is will that be addressed in terms of that infrastructure, given particularly the time frame to which you're suggesting?
So, Dan, I'll come back to it and then so you're absolutely right. So for colleagues that don't know in the room, the SEND ranges is the local version of the graduate approach, which we launched back on the 17th of November. Really, really positive feedback, really helpful guide to how to assess need and then how to group needs for children, which will inform how you then provide to meet those needs. What we didn't do, it was considered, what we didn't do is say, and the ranges comes into force immediately the moment we launch on the 17th, and any funding request will then be linked to that. But what we know we will do, and the aspiration is from the next academic year, that the ranges will be the tool that we will ask all schools, colleges, early years to use to identify needs that will then be linked to funding. That's where we want to get to. The gap in between that Andy's outlined, and there's loads more, obviously loads more detail, is supporting all providers in schools to get from where we are now to where we need to be to get the application process right. And in tandem with that, it will be how do we ensure that we've got the panel process running far more effectively and efficiently. Again, panel opened up to parents, to providers, very happy to open that up. What I would see by bringing in a more consistent, coherent approach to applying for funding, well, to assessing need first and then applying for funding, panel structure should be a lot easier. because there's a clarity for everybody about how we will allocate resources and how we will assess needs. That's a lot of the driver behind the work we're doing. So I would hope the panel's job should get a lot easier, and actually panels should focus on probably 10% of children that are really on the grey boundaries between different bands. That's what I expect them to focus on. There's a huge piece of work to go on in tandem of getting the panel from where it is now to where it needs to be. I'll take that challenge. And again, we're going to do this as openly as we possibly can, because it's not us doing it, it's the collective.
Yeah, I think it comes back to your point around transparency, doesn't it? Historically, on the cloak and dagger, you sent off a request that we came back at 246, and there wasn't even necessarily a level of challenge around that. If the response came back, it wasn't necessarily favourable or the best for needs of the children. So, yeah, I think transparency is the key term here, isn't it?
Completely. Dan, as you were talking about, I wrote down audit in 23-24. That audit sounds a scary word, doesn't it? But I do think once we've got to September, we then, again, Royal, we collective, we then need to have a look back on how has it worked from September 23, so probably Easter 24. I'll be really open about that. And if that transparency isn't working, then we need to change it. I hope through visiting both your school, lots of other schools already as well. What I'm trying to pick up on is the bureaucracy involved in the panel process. And you've been far more polite than some people around that. The perception of the cloak and dagger and the lack of transparency, that's what I'm trying to bring. So reduce the amount of paperwork with a real consistency to the application process and the decision-making process. So hopefully people will know it far easier than should go through one. That's the point.
And I've got one more. This is a really open question. I apologise for its nature. It might not necessarily be answered now. You mentioned around the significant overspending in the finance block and getting at Westbrook, etc. How does this piece of work fit into addressing that?
I think that's a really good question, Dan. I don't know. What we know at the moment is there is inconsistency in the way that funding has to happen. We know that within West Northants, and if we look within the region, certainly within the region as well. So what I believe by bringing in a really rigorous approach to how we assess need, how we allocate funding, we will then also be looking at whether that happens. So, as an example, we know we've got a number of children in residential settings that cost us an incredible amount of money. So we're looking at that because of the money it costs us, because we're also, I am, not speaking on everyone, I am certainly clear that our county provision doesn't equal the best outcomes yet. I want children back where they live, within their local communities. That's what I think they should do. So we're doing some work to benchmark costs against other local councils. We might have an out-of-council provider that charges us 150% more than it charges another. So we're doing that work to try and bring a consistency and a clarity to how we allocate those resources, which should hopefully give us a very good outcome. That's one. And then the other side, we haven't really focused on, I haven't focused on, is non-EHCP pupils. As you said, it's getting intervention early and doing it early. That's how we really make a difference, not just for outcomes of children, it's just
Sorry, I know I answered the questions there.
That's absolutely fine, thank you. Thanks. Has anyone else got any questions for Ben and Andy from the virtual meeting? No? Okay, that was lovely. Thank you. Thanks very much for the information. We look forward to receiving updates at each of the next meetings as well. So, Beth, agenda item 7, the schools funding active consultation.
Thank you. So I'm bringing back the results of the schools consultation in this paper. You might want to look at it at the same time as the consultation document that we brought to the last meeting. So if I run through the main subject areas, and this paper we do need to take votes on at the end. So if I outline the votes and perhaps you can discuss the areas, and then I'll leave it to James to run the votes at the end for each of the items. So the first item is the specialist services, and there were two options provided. One was to continue the 22-23 arrangement, which is a top slice greater than the 0.5% in the schools block, to be transferred into the high needs block to fund these services centrally. And that's where we have to have a strong view from the consultation that it's what schools want. We have to have a strong view from schools forum members that that's what they want, and we have to take it to the Minister for Education with a disapplication request to allow greater than 0.5%. Option 2 was to top slice up to the maximum, where we wouldn't have to ask permission. This is just a schools forum member decision to top slice the schools block by the 0.5%. And with that, we would continue to fund the SEND service centrally, but then sensory impairment service would have to be charged at the point of delivery, schools buying those services when they need them. And then we put an option there for other. So the responses that came back to that question on specialist services were, we had 19 in favour of option 1, the top slice of 2.2 million, which is continuing 22-23's process, and option 2 of just a 0.5% top slice, that's 38 respondents in favour of that. So the next item that we consulted on was the split site policy. This is an area that has been local formula, remains local formula for 23-24. The government are currently consulting on split site policy becoming national for the following year, 24-25. But this is rolling forward the current policy that we have in place for 22-23. So the first part is looking at the policy, and the next part is the rates. And we had 43 vote in favour of this for the policy. 11 said it's not applicable to them, and 3 no response. For the rates, 43 in favour, 11 not applicable, and 3 no response, and nobody voted no. The next item was the growth fund policy and weighted numbers. So this is a top slice to the schools block to fund the growth in year, and also the planned growth in schools that are new and growing, or that are taking on additional bulge classes. The growth funding policy, we requested to roll that forward with just one minor change, adding a clause to allow extraordinary growth events to be funded. And the sort of thing we had in mind there were where refugees are taken in by schools in year, unexpectedly. They might not be up to the 15 needed to fulfil the policy, and they might not be above PAN, but without funding, they have to cover additional needs. The government funding doesn't always initially follow, so that was why that was added in. We had 46 respond to say yes, they agree with that policy and the change to the policy. 2 disagreed, 7 said not applicable to them, and 2 no response. For the growth funding rates, that was just a similar sort of level of response, 45 saying yes, 3 said no, 7 said not applicable, and 2 no response. The next item was looking at the central expenditure, which is a schools forum member vote. And it says in the guidance to do it line by line as a vote. So the historical commitments, that's the part of the block that's reducing by 20% each year. And we have less and less joint funded, general funded and DSG funded services, that's being unwound. We are reaching a point where the historical teachers' pensions, which we can't avoid the costs of, are going to be met, but for 23-24 we can still fund them from within that reduced block. And then ongoing responsibilities for the schools forum, admissions, national copyright licenses, corporate overheads, teachers' pay and pension grants, the education entitlement team, and contribution to the high needs deficit. The responses to that were 48 in favour, nobody responded no, 7 said not applicable, 2 said no response. The two gave no response. Then we're moving on to the trade union facility time item. I should have said at the beginning that we have trade union members with us here to speak to this item before the vote's given, which we do that at the end of reading the results of the consultation. So the trade union responses. At the last schools forum, when we brought the draft consultation paper, schools forum members asked us to provide another option, one which would show a lower rate, top slice per pupil for facility time. So we've shown that, we went out to consultation with option 2, which was 10% lower per pupil rate, and with a corresponding 10% less facility time bought from members. That option will, I think, increase the amount of administration required to run that, as we'll have to go from charging a dev somebody's time to monitoring hours and doing 10%, so 90% of the day, and making sure we're paying for that. And then after that's used up, schools will have to buy anything additional. So it will require a lot more monitoring and administration. So option 1 was the continuation of the de-delegation at the previous level. Option 1 votes, we had 11 in favour. Option 2, continuation, but at 10% less, we had 22 in favour of that. Option 3 was 2, which is essentially no de-delegation, but bought by schools individually. 19 responded not applicable, and the vote for this is a maintained school member vote, but it is still applicable to academies in a way because they can buy into this service. 3 gave no response. So school improvement grant de-delegation, we proposed a rate of £7.50. We had 24 in favour, 3 against, 29 said not applicable, and no response. Redundancy de-delegation, 26 in favour, 1 said no, 29 said not applicable, 1 no response. So I think we should move now to letting the trade union members come and speak.
Yes, I'm happy with that, and then we'll run through questions on the server. Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to address everybody. My name is Richard. I'm the school convener for Unison. I'm talking on behalf of our Unison colleagues. Thank you for the survey. Obviously, our preferred option would be option 1. You'd expect me to say that, but I'm going to tell you some of the reasons why we think that. Firstly, over the many years now, we've been able to keep the delegation rate for facility time at £2.10. Last year, we didn't increase it, or we didn't negotiate to increase it, just because we'd gone to unitary, we were all coming out of a pandemic, and we was all expecting a national insurance increase, and we was able to balance the budget that way. We've been working with Beth and Rosemary to try and put some options together this year. You will all know that the HR providers for maintained schools is now no longer maintained under the local authority. That they have to outsource those HR providers. And so our work within the union has increased for the numbers of outsourced HR providers. And we do have a good relationship with them. Strictly Education, EPM, Orbit, we are their kind of interface, because when you as a head teacher have a problem or an issue with staff, you will ask them for their guidance. Our facility time enables us to talk with those HR providers and come to a better resolution, quicker resolution. Okay, it means that your HR provider can advise you better, and we can advise our members better, which means that we have that conversation and you can get on with your head teaching. Okay. So our work has increased. I think you need to be aware for the local authority that at the minute you do not get any feedback of any major HR issues that come out of the schools because it doesn't come through your HR department. So we as the union reps can be a vital link when we report back to things like DCF meetings. Obviously, we can't divulge confidential matters, but it's one of the reasons why our work is increasing. Another reason is we've got a lot more staff on sickness, on COVID. A lot more staff have realised that what am I doing here? I need to retire. How can I retire early? And there's a lot more staff being referred to occupational health to have reasonable adjustments because they realise they can't afford to retire. So you need to understand that the risk of reducing facility time 10% means that issues will escalate more quickly and resolving the issues will be more slowly, therefore costing you time and money. We do defer lots of general inquiries. Members will ring us up and say, where do we stand with this? Where do we stand with that? And in talking with the HR providers, quite often I will tell our members, actually, the head teacher can put them in whatever year they want to, because they're running the schools and the needs of the staff and the children. So our aim is we need happy staff in schools supporting pupils. We are there to support your policies and your processes through disciplinary, through things like capability. And we also need to realise that, particularly with support staff, they are leaving the profession because of the current climate. They're leaving the profession because they can earn more money elsewhere. Our aim for our facility time is to ensure that you retain your good staff that you need in post. And just to finish off, really, the consequences of not maintaining the facility time as it stands will probably result in lots more cases going to employment tribunal. We're there to help try to resolve issues properly and fairly, not only for our members, but also for the employer. And that's why we exist. So before you make that vote, please consider what the potential cost could be to you if you reduced the facility time or didn't have it. Any other comments from my union colleagues?
Thank you. I can't really say much more than what my colleague from Unison has already said, apart from the fact of that, yes, we are getting more cases within schools, and we do tend to see off an awful lot of cases that would potentially end up in an employment tribunal or at a conciliation before it gets to that. And again, in terms of employees retiring, we can often see it probably sometimes before the school does. And we then manage the expectations of the our member, the employee, and guide them down that route and get them to a better place. I can only urge you to make the right decision this afternoon, because you know it's really, really important going forward.
Thank you. Just one last comment from me, while I'm taking the questions, is that we do have a good relationship with your HR providers. But when it comes to restructuring, redundancies, tubing over to academies, it's been apparent in the last 12 months that we have not been given the heads up as we did when we worked with our local authority, HR colleagues. We usually got the heads up in good time. Sometimes we're going to be given 2 or 3 days notice to attend the consultation meeting. That's something that we're working with our HR providers. But as academisation continues, our workload is only going to increase again on that, and we need to do that with our facility time. Failure to do that means that we can't engage in a meaningful consultation and delays any kind of processes going forward. That's all I have to say, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Has anyone got any questions first of all for anyone?
Just like to ask you first.
Yes, please do.
My name is Robert Johnston. I'm from the NSUWT Teaching Union. I'm recently very new to the role. I'd just like to say that I echo the word that my colleagues have said. I think our caseloads are ever increasing. As I say, where once we had one policy, now with academisation, we have many policies that we have to review. Our workload is only increasing, so we've seen very short-sighted to reduce facilities time. If anything, we should be increasing because our workload is all increasing, and we have some a lot with long COVID, and many teachers off with stress, anxiety, like with the Brexit groups, and as we say, many teachers retire outside of age group of more education. So if nothing else, we would like to say
has anyone got any questions for union colleagues? And then we'll go to questions on the consultation papers from there. But just
Here's a question. Totally recognise the pressure, particularly the restructures on our chief. I'm more than happy to include something from your on union's behalf in Head West or in one of the correspondents and send out to all schools, just urging people to get in contact with her. I'm really happy. If you want some words that you would like me to share, the best way to do it. I'm happy to speak after the meeting to share contact details or through James. I'm more than happy to.
Thank you. Firstly, I think it's pretty clear that union representation play a critical role in school life. So first and foremost, there's a real appreciation from the maintenance perspective. Thank you. I think really it's just a question stroke observation. Firstly, it's the increase in the cost, as you've mentioned, we're going from £2.10 to £3.57. You've outlined the reasons as to why that is, and they're understandable. I think speaking for maintain positive has come at a time at which, as you quite mentioned earlier on, costs on schools at the moment in line with potential utilities and staffing increased costs that you mentioned around plus 2,000 or something to that effect. I think has really influenced the outcome of the questionnaire. That is obviously, so I don't think it's the case that maintain head teachers don't value the representation. I think it's just almost like a perfect storm in many respects. So I guess it's really kind of question stroke statement. Wasn't an option where that could also be slightly subsidised or offset by the authority to bring that cost down, that £3.57 from a maintain perspective? I don't know if that's a possibility or it could be a very naive question.
In terms of costs, I think you're to bet because they can't pass a deficit budget on that. Personally, what I will say, the East Midlands average cost per pupil with the delegation for facility time over the past 4 years has been £3.56. So Northamptonshire has been paying a lot less. We didn't have a crystal ball this time this year, did we? So we totally understand your heating bills have gone up, and you know, I talked to a lot of head teachers, and managing things since out of the pandemic restrictions were lifted is a lot harder. And we want to work with you to support staff, to support the teachers on that. We get it's a big jump. We could have increased it last year. We chose not to because of those pressures, unitary, pandemic, national insurance increases, which was on the table, then went off the table, then come back on the table again. But that's what the East Midlands average is for people, and pressures all around. We get that. So, Claire, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll come in there. We're very locked down in what we can spend funding on, as you know, from the blocks. In terms of the schools block, this dedelegation funding is only applied to maintain schools if agreed by maintained members, but it is then sold to academies because any dedelegation in the legislation has to be offerable to academies on the same per pupil basis. We've seen less buy into that for this year. The other sort of areas it could come from, the Central School Services block, as you can see, it's reducing from 20% each year in the historical part, and it's essentially before, but you know, where would it come from? But we're a bit stuck really. I think there is something as well to think about going forwards as more schools academise, the pot shrinks, if they go into large academy trusts can often afford their own union rep. So it's the smaller schools that we need to think about, and when they're all academised in the government's plan, how do we create this central sort of, would it become a traded service rather than through dedelegations? I think there's something to be looked at for the future of how it needs to be managed.
And I think that's the difficulty, isn't it, is that there is absolute value in union representation, and I'm sure maintained heads would echo that. It's just where there are also additional pressures in terms of pay increases and so forth. And is this inevitably going to get more costs going to increase year on year?
Yeah, I mean, you need the support of the customers. How is it what the cheapest way of getting it for?
I hate to catastrophise it, but it's a little bit of an insurance policy in terms of, can you afford to risk it and pay the cost of longer sickness, you know, longer kind of agency staff, potential more cost of ET, employment renewals, and it is the insurance policy basically. And I don't want to catastrophise it because I get on with the majority of the head teachers I consult with. I'm always asking them to say, look, I get one side of the story, you tell me things from your perspective, and then they say, well, we support the staff with this, and it means that I can give our members better advice, and your HR providers can give you better advice, and reducing that puts that in.
Thank you. I think, first of all, are there any more questions for union colleagues from the floor or from our members attending virtually? And I think one of the comments I've got is, it is the scale of the increase at times of really pressurised budgets. And I appreciate exactly what you said about bringing this area up to the average for the East Midlands. That I think has probably given rise to the information that's come back on the surveys, which is a rejection of putting it up that much. But I think as well there's two reasons, of course, why there is such an increase. I think we mentioned at the previous meeting that there were carry forwards from previous years that effectively being used up, which has kept the rate low, and that will apply to some of it. And then the other one is the pool of schools that are contributing into this with academisation over the last couple of years has reduced significantly, and those two elements plus some general inflation reason why there was such a change.
And also a third one in academies is not buying into the service as much, not as many academies are buying in.
Just on that point, I think Beth's right, and there's a little bit of work into looking to the future. I'm more than willing to be working with yourselves to, present the case to academies to buy into the service, because actually it helps both parties with that. We do get on well with lots of academies. We've got facility time agreements with some of them, but not all of them. And there is definitely a piece of work to do there for the future. We recognise that in the next 5 or 6 years, more maintained schools are going to be moving to academies, and we welcome to work with you to look at how we can move that forward and promote them to buy into the service. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
I agree, working with more and more academies. I'm not sure I agree lots more schools are going to become academies now. We don't have an education bill though, so I don't know. I think you're right, there needs to be a wider spread, and I would love to know that you're in every single school and in every academy, and providing that advice, guidance, support. I think we need to be clear about the role of this group, because this group can talk about maintained schools. We cannot, as much as we can compel, we can give information to a multi-academy trust. We can't make any decisions around the academy trust either. So I think everyone knows that, so it's clear. So the decision that this group can make is around maintained and around the level of funding. I said I'm more than happy to write to all schools, encouraging schools to make contact, to build that relationship, to not get in any of those difficult positions. I think that's the best way to do it. I'm sure there's other forums with academies as well. So we need to know they're one and the same, in a way. For our purposes this afternoon, they're very good.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
GMB has a role. Not just how much you but do come in very
Everyone's happy with that? Then we'll move on to questions on the general paper. Questions on the consultation paper and the responses to the consultation paper.
Chair, one was just around the summary and the delegation option guidance for improvement grants. In the previous minutes, it was costed at £5.50, but it's now increased to £5.90. Just wanted to ask a question around that.
Apologies, it's the original.
So, if we look at the votes, then what I was suggesting, James, we run through them individually, one at a time. To start with, and I think the first one is on specialist services. So just as a reminder, on the specialist services from the consultation paper, the options 1, options 2 on the top slides, and particularly in relation to impairment services, the responses we got back, which I forgot to mention earlier, I think that we had quite a number of responses this year compared to previous years, where we've had 4 or 5, I think it's 50 odd responses this year. So we've got better representation, which is really good and really helpful for our members to form our decisions. With regards to this one, then the consultation paper came, the consultations came back with a preference for option 2. 4 members can be informed by the consultation on any of these questions or form our own opinions on it. So if we look at having a vote on that, James, shall we, do you want to vote by option or whether to accept the consultation preferences?
I think Mr. Chair is proposing second an option. Take a vote on that.
Dan, would you like to? You.
Okay,
I'm to second that. So, in relation to specialist services, can we have a vote on whether to accept option 2 as the way forward? If on the screens, if you can put your hands up, put your camera on the hands up, that'd be great. Yeah. So, I'm fine with that. That is, yeah. Any one against? One against. So that option 2 is carried by a majority vote. On the split site policy, I'm happy to propose the agreement of the split site policy on both the rates and the policy. Don't have to second that. So,
and through you, Chair, just to be clear, this is a consultative vote. This is a local authority decision, but getting the forum's view on the matter.
okay. So again, all those in favour of agreement to the split site policy? Okay, no worse. So none against, no abstentions. And that applies to the rates. The growth fund, I think there was an overwhelming consultation response to approval of the growth fund policy with the addition of the flexibility that provided in there for next year. So again, if we can vote, is everyone happy with the growth fund policy to approve it as is? Can I ask colleagues who are attending virtually as well? Put your hand up if you are happy with it.
Sorry, can I just be clear on, is this the roll forward with the increased rates?
Yes, I think so. With the rates that were set out in the policy and that discretionary provision in there in exceptional circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we happy with that? In the room, so. Right. Yeah, unanimous, is it? Yeah, everyone happy with that? Okay. That's the growth fund.
Through the Chair, I think it's also necessary, subject to correction that schools forum is asked to agree the weighted numbers as set out in the West Northamptonshire School Budget Consultation document, and schools forum is asked to agree to set the growth fund budget at 1.6 million for 23-24.
Okay. Are members happy with those? Yeah. Okay.
So, again,
Unanimous. Thank you.
and the same on agreeing to set the growth fund budget to 1.6 million.
Any objections? No? That's fine. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Right, central schools budgets. So, now, do we need to go through these line by line, or can we just take a vote on the paper as it stands with the budget set?
Through you, Chair, my understanding is that advice we previously had from the SFA is that it's possible to agree them en bloc, provided the schools forum is asked is happy to take that approach. Clearly, that gives members an opportunity to indicate if they have issues with particular parts of it, in which case it would be necessary to go through line by line.
Okay. So generally, with the central schools expenditure block, as set out in the paper, are forum members happy to approve the central schools block funding budgets? And if not, we'll go through them line by line. But if everyone's happy to go through them and vote on this in one block, yeah? Okay, I say everyone nodding. So are we happy to approve the central schools blocks as is? Set out in the paper? Yeah? Yeah? Fantastic. Okay. That's good. Now we come to the delegations. So there are 3 D-delegations here, and the D-delegations, I think, are the maintained school representatives who vote on this. This is not a vote general forum. So. So down. On the basis, I know, and I should say, and make this quite clear, we obviously have a couple of our maintained representatives who weren't able to get here today. But Dan, who is here, with any of these folks I know now and from previous experience, diligently seeks the views, not just from what is laid out in the consultation of colleagues in the maintained sectors, so has a very good grasp of the feeling in relation to these items and to these votes. So we'll run through the votes on them. So if I come back to, and again, thank you very much for our union colleagues for the discussions and the contributions they've made to the discussion that we had around the trade union facilities time. The consultations came back, I think, for the reasons that we talked about during that discussion, with a preference for continuing with a dedelegation on trade union facilities time, but on the basis of a 10% less time, i.e. it would be 10% less than £3.57, which would provide additional monies that historically have been provided, but this next 12 months, not necessarily at the level that has been requested. So obviously you've also had the opportunity to listen to the representations that have been made. So can I ask, are you in favour of the recommendations and the options as laid out in the consultation, or do you feel something different?
I think importantly, Chair, is just to note that I am a representative of the Maintain Fund, so although I have my own views, is as a representative of that body of primary school head teachers, and quite clearly, as set out within the questionnaire, the favour is of option 2, irrespective of my personal views. So I propose option 2.
Right, thank you, Dan. So, yeah, happy with that. The school improvement grant, for everyone who said it's applicable to them, we've established the rate as at £5.50. There's just a typo on here. So at the proposed rate of £5.50. Happy with that? Yes. And the redundancy, the delegation of proposed rate of £4. There was a response to that. Happy with that? Okay. Thank you, everyone. There's a lot of votes to get through on a lot of issues that are very important to everyone, and so I'm pleased we've been able to work our way through those. And again, I'm very grateful to trade union colleagues for coming in and making representations. The work that you do and all of you do, and the value of that is very well appreciated by all academies and the maintained schools. But they felt on this occasion that putting the rates up is appropriate, but with all the other pressures, it's just a little bit too much at this time for the full rate. But please don't think that that is not any kind of underappreciation of the work that's done there. It's not. It's very, very valuable. And I know Schools Forum appreciate that, as do all our members. So thank you. Thank you very much for participating in that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this paper is the draft consultation which we bring to you before we take it out to the early years providers. It's very much for you to input into it if you think it could be worded better. The questions, the options, we've drafted with 2 different financial settlements because we haven't yet received the financial information. Obviously, we're waiting for that any day now. When we actually go out to the sector in January, we will only show one option because we'll have the final figures. So it will be a bit clearer than the tables, which have lots of columns and show 2 different options. The early years national funding formula released in July gave us an indicative figure. So that's shown, but also I've shown the minimum uplift, the sort of protected level below which it can't drop. I think it's most useful to probably go through the updates, the key issues, set bullet points at the beginning of the paper. So we've had the early years national funding formula consultation. We haven't got the results back yet, but that's given us an indication that the teachers paying pensions grant, which we paid separately in 22-23, have been rolled into the base hourly rates that we receive for 3 and 4 year olds. For university and extended or additional as they call it hours. In 23-24, our aim is to pass through 95% of the DfE funding for 3 and 4 year olds. This has always been our aim from 22-23. That comes down obviously to the vote from Schools Forum members on the 7th of February, around that 5%. That's the Schools Forum member decision. All Schools Forum members, not just early years members. Our aim is to continue to pass through 100% of funding for the 2 year old providers. There's nothing additional rolled into that, the teachers' pay and pension grant is indicated to be enrolled into the 3 and 4 year old rates. The consultation will propose that 95% of any increase in the DfE funding rate for 3 and 4 year olds will be rolled into the hourly base rates. There's a bullet point there to sort of give a brief explanation about the contingency within the budget, which isn't a contingency kept separate from the providers. That's a contingency that we expect to be paid to providers. We're paid a 2-year-old rate and a 3 and 4 year old rate based on 2 January censuses, but the hours that we pay out are usually more than the hours we're funded for. So that contingency covers that difference. That's our estimate, which is obviously quite difficult to do after 2 years of COVID payments, which are done on a different basis than the January census basis. WNC are preparing to remove the notional send from our local funding formula. So instead, we'll be moving, we aim to move 4p of that inclusion fund into the inclusion fund from the notional send to meet the budgetary pressures that we have in that area, and the rest is just part of the base rate. The maintained nursery supplement distribution has been changed to make it more, to make it nationally fairer on a fair basis. The information in this document is based on the indicative provisional figures, and again that may change with the settlement. 2 main changes locally for us are that we're proposing to distribute 5% of whatever supplement we do receive based on the income deprivation affecting children indices. And we've already gone up to consult with the maintained nursery sector, school sector, to get their opinions on that. We currently have £1 million in reserves in the DSG balances from 2020-21 due to the COVID reductions. I think you remember in the year we paid out 65% of our balances, and we held some back to see what would happen sort of following COVID, the changes through COVID and the changes in the way we're being funded, and also to get the final results of the funding formula, which comes in the July following the end of the financial year. So we're in a position now. Also, obviously, we've had a change of senior leadership. So we're in a position now to start looking at how we distribute that funding out to the settings, and hopefully that will be able to support with some of the inflationary increases and living costs generally. So the first table gives information on the increase that's in the provisional. So our base rate for 3 and 4 year old funding that we receive is £4.66 in 22-23. There's an indication that we'll receive an increase of 21p on that rate, but that includes the teachers' pay and pension grant. For the 2 year old settings, we currently get £5.62 per hour, and that will increase provisionally by 19p. I think it's worth remembering with the first graphic in 3.2 that the 3 and 4 year old rate funding comes to us in that particular based on the numbers of children that we have and also additional needs and an area cost adjustment. But the 4 year old funding has to cover the central amount that's retained, the 3 and 4 year old base rate, any special educational needs inclusion fund, the deprivation supplement, and the talk about the contingency as well has to cover all of that. So when we have a 21p increase on the 3 and 4 year old rate that comes to us, that doesn't turn into a 21 or close to 21p increase in the base rate for 3 and 4 year olds. So to try and illustrate that, the column in table 2 to the far right hand side shows how we would plan to distribute that 21p increase if that is what we finally receive. And I think that's hopefully an easy way to think about it, because if we end up with 18p or a 25p increase, we would proportionally propose to distribute it on that same basis proportionally. The way we're showing that 21p being distributed, it's quite difficult to try and consult on something before we've seen the final figures when there's so many changes being proposed. So I won't go through all of the paper, hopefully you've all had a chance to read it, but if there are any questions or suggestions that you'd like to see as amendments to this consultation before it goes out, we'll be happy to take your questions and suggestions.
Board members, are there any questions you got for this?
Just a question about the 5% that goes to the central pot. Are we able to know what that pays for, what that goes towards, how that supports us in our earlier settings?
Yes. I think that there is some detail in the paper, there's a lot of information. And there is some detail in here about how that goes to the team that support early years providers, that make payment, that do all the work behind the scenes. More than happy to break that down in a little bit. That's what the DfE set that 5% as that's the way, that's what we need for that illustration. But I'm happy to break that down a little bit for this group or directly yourself.
Yes, please. That'll be really useful.
Yeah, and that might be helpful as well, when if that goes in the consultation paper, just saying, pointing what that's used for as part of the consultations. Are there any other questions about Ben on this at the moment? So, are we happy as a group then for the consultation paper to go out as set out by the, with the from January, and you'll have by then you'll have a firmer idea of which of the rates that we're putting in.
Yeah, hopefully. I know a lot of local authorities are holding back consulting until they've got it.
Yeah.
Through you, Chair, it sounded like that was happy with the consultation paper as proposed, subject to the addition of some further detail about the breakdown of the 5%.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the establishment of which will have the settlement, so we'll know funding rates and we're actually consulting on the options. Okay.
I'll just draw people's attention to one bit, because I think it's important. I hope it helps. Right at the bottom of the second page, the introduction around the key issues, it talks about the £1 million reserve that the council has, and the proposal, and this isn't part of the consultation at all, but I just think it's important that we note that £500,000 is paid out straight away to providers, just to recognise the current pressures. Now, we have talked about how much would be appropriate. We can't love to be able to say we can pay everything out. We've still got to have a contingency and a bit of protection. But that's just trying to recognise the pressure that early providers are under, which we know is significant. So that isn't part of the formal consultation, that's in here. I think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think it's and as you say, because you've still got we haven't got the accounts closed from predecessor authority and hence ours, there is a risk, albeit small risk, that number might change. And so I think spreading it over a couple of years, by the time we reach the next year of spend, we should have hopefully the account signed off, so we should have a rock solid open position. I know those are only small risks, but they are nevertheless still there, and so there's some immediate support plus the potential of further support there. That brings us on to agenda item 9. Simon, hello Simon. Thank you for joining us. Can I just give a bit of an introduction to this, because for Simon's benefit as well, just as a recap for Schools Forum, there are a number of issues around the PFI and the PFI administration of schools, but the one of them that really hit, particularly our maintained colleagues, but it hit everyone, was getting dumped a significant increase in April after the budget's been set, with an increase in cost and a significant increase in cost that would have pushed many of the maintained schools into deficits, but certainly was just incredibly poor practice, really poor practice. We've gone through our budgeting processes. With the academies, you start a little bit later because you work another year. And so we had requested from our April meeting that in October that we return to Forum with an indication of the pressures and the PFI and what it was likely to do rolling forward, so that we've got some indication of how that's likely to impact on the budgets and on what the maintained schools and academies are expected to pick up versus what might be picked up by the council or from other ways of trying to mitigate any cost increases. We know the PFI contracts aren't that complicated, despite the fact that they are made out to be. They are just straightforward 30-year contracts. And within most of those, they will always have an inflationary element that usually is actually attached to RPI as opposed to CPI, depending on when those contracts were signed and what was the measure at the time. And so we know that those are baked in. We know that obviously with current inflation concerns, that's not going to be great news for us. And that the council and yourselves and your officers will be doing as much as they can to mitigate those cost increases. But at the October meeting, we were assured that we would have a paper then, and it didn't materialise, and it hadn't materialised. So I've taken sounds from across Forum members, and I know that we're incredibly disappointed about that performance, and that we're here for the second meeting. I welcome you and welcome the opportunity for you to kind of give some thoughts and around where you think the costs are heading and how that is likely to impact on schools and the academies that are qualified schools. So thank you very much for coming and seeing us today, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping James. Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping James will be able to do the magic with my presentation. While that's happening, I'll perhaps introduce myself. Obviously, we are new in the sense that company new even PFI for legal. So we're at 18-month distance. Colin Barrett, who were effectively here from, works in my team, Colin the project authority, as well as being able to physically, other reasons. So we decided I would come to this presentation. So, that working? Right, okay, we have next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so as I've been alluded to, a report was requested for the Schools Forum. We held back in October. The position was continuously changing. We've been essentially useless to communicate something to you. It was not a comprehensive down. I apologise if that's completely me. And of course, that remains information is changing. Waiting list every month. We've had a number of physical events you may have noticed. And most recently, we had a use. made now. Therefore, that I've mentioned because it's empty, it runs up until the first game. Main extensions during that. Ended, which covers costs, constructing, expanding, for example, schools in the early stages, both the interest and the capital. It covers life cycle costs. And it covers FM.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt here, but I think people online can't hear. Can the microphone be moved a little bit closer, please?
Move it even closer, hopefully.
Much better. Thank you very much.
My apologies. So there were two ways of extensions. Sorry, cover that line. So two extensions, and then we could cover which essentially finance, life cycle costs, and FM capacity. And it's made up, again, if you could do a different way, two forms. The original basic charges and the cost of school changes. Cost of school changes are relatively minor compared to the basic charges, but they're part of it. If we move on again. So from the start, it was known the existing FM budget, as they were back in 2005, wouldn't cover the costs. And that was for a variety of reasons, including budget and purpose, the condition of the buildings at the time, and of course the FM charges under the PFI, life cycle costs with the capacity FM costs. And so that's been managed by simply awareness of those issues and planning accordingly, by a special allocation of DSG by PFI. See, I think it's two involved special cases, and the use of three general fund resources. So back in 2005, the FM charges, which arose from the contract, were divided between exactly. And subsequently, with various changes, naturally, that it's worth just reflecting that comparison with the FM charge and other FM costs not easy. We don't collect data start in terms of school types, and schools vary in the way that they handle FM. And finally, the PFI contains something that classic, which is visual. They are all in certain respects, in all respects, do in certain respects. They get, but they have. Right back at the start, the service charge or the FM charge is just under. Something didn't include filters, that's changed. This year, and this should be compared to the total utility charge you see is 39.65 million. Sorry, can we? Of which the FM charge is a little lower. That charges and that's a base. The context of charges, again, we've touched on some of this stuff. current economic climate is making it difficult to predict. Unhelpfully, this contract is based on actual inflation rate. Every other contract I know you 6 months. Previously. So we know, you know, the ESG element for this is going to increase by 2%. And if the actual inflation is higher than the council. You may also see, WNC has published its draft budget now. That draft budget assumes a maximum of 5% plus tax increase, the amount, the largest amount we're allowed to do without the referendum. Referendum is generally not held. The Bedfordshire Police and Crime Commission did have a go a few years ago and down. So I think the general rule is you don't try and go by the referendum. It shows a £35.6 million budget gap to be covered by efficiencies, misguided government. Some of those I have to say are, they're not high risk, we've already high risk, but there are certainly areas with quite challenging effort to deliver that. So, and only by doing that, the council will actually help its own budget. And it does not any allowance for meeting PFI inflation costs. So that's where we are. So 23-24, we're currently looking at inflation, in this case it's RPIX, around 13%. In fact, the last is 13.9%. But we are seeing some signs of pressure. I think given those prices coming down, and there's one or two other commodity prices that we need to go up. So we're hopeful that it won't be 13.9. We'll also be got like that. So that results in a 13% rise. It increase to significant amount. So how does that pan out? Well, if you look at this table, I apologise, it's a bit of an amount you can digest. But the simple lines to focus on unitary charge FM payments rises to 20 million, with an increase of 2.3 million, and the school recharge is almost balance that at 2.35 million, which means that the increase in the cost to school above the 11.2% to get with the budgets is £900, 16,000, which is about £43 per student. Now, I'm not saying it's really important per student, but it gives you a sense of how we're going to put that. So for each of your schools, you know how they are and the students you have there, putting dirty assessment on what that means. That's it pretty much in a nutshell. We acknowledge it's a current situation, not a message I bring with any pleasure. I know politicians likewise prefer to bring a better and more comfortable message, but it is the reality of the situation we face. We've also welcome, we're happy to work through with each school what the implications would be for those schools. The council budget consultation formally launched our cabinet next week, and please do respond to that. And of course, and the final budget is usually set on the 22nd of February. You see how great I'll get to the end of that slide.
I just wanted to ask you, Simon, if it is possible for members of the board to have a copy of your slides. Because it's quite, I saw on the screen people busy writing, and I thought it'd be much easier if they had your original slides.
That's fine, we'll certainly.
Okay, if I go first with the question, then the increases are very formulaic. They are what they are in contracts you sign, you pay time service. That whilst there is an option to renegotiate, there's time consuming, and that's not going to make any immediate impact at all. What might make an immediate impact, though, is, and I'm sure others have noticed this, there's always been difficult, not just for this PFI, I have to say, another PFI contracts where I've been involved in school working relationship with them. But there seems to be an extraordinarily high deterioration in service of the PFI at the moment. So can you give us any indication of the sums of money that we can expect to see return through non-performance contract. It might offset some of the cost pressures. I appreciate, and we've had this conversation before, that in an ideal world, the contract is executed perfectly. We don't see any money back on that, but we have a perfectly executed contract and services fully provided. But generally speaking, we're a long way from that and heading in the wrong direction. So from the forum's point of view and the discussions around the finances, as opposed to anything around contract performance per se and contract management, what kind of sums are we expecting to be able to recover from the contract to offset some of the increases we're likely to see because of the basically this appalling performance of the contractor at this present time?
Thank you, Chair. I think the first thing I would say is we acknowledge that I did issue. That's one of that is concerned. The second thing I would say is seeking to tackle them. We're doing everything we can. We're legal advice and generally ratcheting up the pressure on to perform. So, in the sense of finances, I wouldn't encourage you to base it on continued performance because, as you said, our object in the contract is performing properly. So, take those caveats first. Having said that, I will need to come back to you with a sensible number, but you're probably well now.
No, I think that I think the last set of figures we saw was about was not far from that. It's about 235,609 from what I remember seeing the paper on. I think it was in April, so it's around that. It was around that kind of number that we historically. But you'll be able to give us give Forum your assurances that that money will come back and will be netted off any costs that won't just disappear into another council budget or any other kind of recovery. That will come back into.
There is a mechanism which I'm not going to define detail of, where some of that money is then by the council, some is then received, and depends on scale of the detail.
Questions down to you.
Thank you, Chair. So the first thing I would say is that maintain representative is some communication is better than none. And I say that, you know, from a maintain perspective when we talk about it by agreement, because I would say there's a lot of frustration at the moment across the maintain primary sector in terms of performance. And I think even if it is a little bit of communication, it does certainly help. So just kind of topping that up again, essentially that's another £20,000 that's going to cost my school. We talked about increasing costs. We've had that conversation multiple times. That's a little bit easier to swallow if we've got that performance that we're talking about. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing at the moment in terms of that representation is that quite simply, you know, that contract isn't being fulfilled in any way, shape, or form. And ultimately, that impacts children. In our school. Yeah. So yes, there is a wide conversation around recouping of cost, etc., but actually on a day-to-day practical basis, it's affecting our children. And at the moment, any staff in my school, and I know it's the same across multiple schools, they're making decisions whether to clean toilets or classrooms. And that quite simply just isn't acceptable. So I know we're not here to talk about that contract specifically, but I'd like to give you a practical example of what head teachers are seeing on the shop floor in terms of those operational demands. And we can talk about raising events and all of those things. The reality is that they're not being actioned. So yeah, I think I need to, in my role, present that to you directly to say, you know, it needs to be addressed.
And we, although we need it, there's no dispute about that. What I would say is we've got the PFIs to restore tomorrow. Yeah, where we can dive into that stuff. So it's not a great plan to deal with that in more detail and try and make sure that we are fully aware of the situation that we can feel. That we are tackling them anyway. Good and well from your.
Yeah, I would suggest you will get that from multiple schools, and it isn't necessarily going to, that hasn't changed since I joined the authority. I think nothing that's really ever come of it. I think that's the frustration.
No, I get that. I have a history of dealing with contractors, and I'm hopeful I can bring some of that experience to bear. This is a particularly structured contract. It's designed to protect ultimately the lender, and that makes it quite hard to take an action model forcefully. But also going to be exploring some of the legal. Between us, we will find.
Yeah, I think just to on the chair's point, it's kind of reassuring piece, isn't it? You know, these conversations are taking place, and we're not going to find ourselves in the same position 3 months' time, 6 months' time, and so on.
I think you're talking about performance or
I think both. I think it's almost you know, there's a parallel here, isn't there, from a cost perspective? You want that reassurance around cost.
yeah. I mean, in a sense, I can't be that reassured. I started by saying these figures are reassured. If inflation hits 20%, you know, then those costs will be there, and we can not promise that I won't do that. Possibly, I might, but I can't give an absolute guarantee. On performance, likewise around flattening, I can't give an absolute guarantee. We are doing what we can, and we are, you know, working through that process. It comes with it. I'm quite happy to set termination that depends on and see the reaction. But we're not there yet. But I cannot give absolute guarantees on it. To be honest with you.
And I think the concern there is that the consequence of that, how it affects maintaining budgets. I'm here to represent maintain. If we're saying it does get to 20% as inflation, what's that going to mean in terms of cost of school? We have a significant amount of schools that are going to deficit because of increased staff costs, utility costs. Now we're looking at the increase in PFI costs. How are schools going to exist? And I know that's not a conversation necessarily or a response directly from yourself. There's obviously an authority answer there, isn't there? Because the reality is that we can't keep absorbing these costs.
We understand the pressure. You know, Beth and I and others, we work together as one team ultimately. And one thing we're keen to make sure we understand what it means to you. And if you can provide good information intelligence on that, that helps us make good decisions.
Yeah, to be frank, that didn't happen last time. As the chair mentioned, it was budget been set. It's going to cost you this amount of money, and I think that's what we're looking for here. You know, we talked about reassurance, but we do need an indication because where there are schools with significant pressures, they're looking at those. They're looking at budgets now, rightly so, and they need to work on almost known variables. Otherwise, you know, we're going to find ourselves in the same position again.
Last year we were dealing with a 5-year benchmarking process, which by its very nature we can't control the time in the same way. So we reached an end, which I believe, it may not feel like it, was actually very much in your favour. Reaching a resolution, putting in far worse, and it took the time that it took, so we couldn't before we resolved it. However, we resolved. This year, only, I use that word cautiously, it is only an inflation index, which doesn't mean there's no negotiation involved, as the chair said, and mathematical formula based on data. So from that point of view, we can be clearer about the process and timescales this year.
Are there any questions from colleagues attending virtually at the moment? So, no, okay. I think Sam, the messages to take away here are very much one. Communication is very important. We didn't get that last time. So even when you go through iterations, these costs are significant for any school, particularly primary school. You know, that kind of cost increase is a TA. Some child isn't going to get the help and support they need, so that the building can be badly maintained. That's where we've got to move forward on that. And I think it's really, I know you'll take that back with you, but they are real world consequences. It's not shoving money on bits of paper. Someone's going to have to lose a TA to pay for that. And that will affect a child's ability to be able to progress the way we'd like them to. but, you know, we do appreciate that you're doing everything you can, and will continue to do everything you can, but please, if you can make sure we have regular updates back into forum on issues around the PFI, that would be very much appreciated. If there's no other comments on that, just thank you very much for. Oh,
Can I just ask, I know that you personally take that responsibility for the communication, because you know that we've had this discussion already about, even if there's no news, just let's
Absolutely.
say there's no news.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thank you, Troy. James, source for forward plan.
Through you, Chair, it's, the board plan is essentially as presented. So clearly, as things stand, it only runs up to 7th of February. So one of the items for the next meeting will be to set the dates for the year ahead. Otherwise, the next meeting will need to deal with the outcomes of the consultation on early years that was presented to the meeting today, and the other business specified.
Okay, thank you. If there's anything anyone feels needs to be added to the agenda, I'd say no, or if you let James go, but these tending to follow the normal rhythm. I haven't been advised of any other urgent business, so I think that concludes our agenda for today. So just to say thank you very much everyone for attending. I wish you a very good Christmas break and a happy Christmas, and I'll close the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.